Next, let's welcome Dr. Regan Deonanan. He is a lecturer here on campus in the Department of Economics. He lectures at all levels, undergraduate and postgraduate, and he's presenting firm barriers to innovation in the Caribbean. Is there a gender gap? Dr. Deonanan?
Good afternoon, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I'm just going to jump straight into the topic by giving you guys a bit of a background into our interest in this particular study. Reading the literature, and this is a literature that spans about 2 decades, there seems to be a prevailing view out there that female firms underperform in the private sector. So we have a bunch of authors that said, going back 2 decades, that said, that show or make the argument that female-owned firms are smaller, have lower employment growth, and are less productive and profitable than male-owned firms. Female firms also tend to be disproportionately concentrated in less well-performing, labor-intensive sectors, such as retail and other service industries, rather than the capital-intensive manufacturing and high-technology sectors. In reading the literature, then the story then that comes out, that emerges, that one story, is that the inferior performance of female-owned firms suggests that women may face a more burdensome business environment than their male counterparts. And this has spawned recent attention in the literature on this topic of whether there in fact exists a gender gap in the business environment in the private sector, both internationally as well as in the region. Now, this larger question of whether there is in fact a gender gap in the private sector is an important one for several reasons. First of all, reducing gender barriers, having full participation of both men and women are important in any developmental strategy for a country. It's something that we want to have all hands on deck, we want to have everybody involved, and to the extent that any one particular group is relegated from or is barred from full participation, that's a problem for all of us for developmental strategy. So it benefits us all, and to the extent that there are barriers, we need to understand whether and to what extent they exist. But the question of whether a gender gap is also important, particularly to women and women entrepreneurs in particular in the region, certainly internationally, but the work here is on the region. The productive potential of women may be thwarted because of these barriers faced, and this limits female participation and their own development. And this has a number of different social issues and implications arising out of that. This topic of whether gender gap matters is particularly important in the context of small island developing states. We already have limited human capital development, at least in terms of numbers, the number of people involved in our workforces. And that's one issue. The other big issue is there are a lot of studies that suggest that private sector engagement is less in the region than we want it to be. And the private sector is seen as a major growth potential, something that can drive the growth within these economies. So this issue of whether a gender gap does exist has implications for all, certainly for female entrepreneurs, and particularly relevant in our context as small island developing states. So far, as I mentioned, there has been recent attention to evaluating, to determining to what extent there is in fact a gender gap. And largely, the literature has focused on one particular type of constraint, financial constraints in particular. And the idea is that, again, if there is underperformance in female-owned firms, for instance, it might be because those firms have limited access to finance relative to their male counterparts. This has attracted both international empirical work, when I say international, empirical work across broad sections of international countries, Atterido et al., for instance, and my colleague over in Barbados, Dr. Moore, I believe his study was in 2016 that focused more on the region. But again, these studies focus on one particular barrier, which is the financial barrier. And the results largely suggest that female-owned firms compared to male-owned firms, there isn't really a gender gap in terms of access to finance. While access to finance is a barrier to private sector development in the region, it's no more of a hurdle for female-owned firms versus male-owned firms. Both of them face the same extent of the hurdle, right? In this paper, we contend that we take the results as is, but we contend that this issue of whether a gender gap actually exists is not really well understood, because we've been looking at just one particular aspect of a barrier, which is the financial barrier. In this particular, it's possible within the literature that constraints, barriers, can arise for different reasons, and therefore the barriers lie elsewhere. Both in terms of formal structures, gender equality laws, for instance, might be a source of disparity, labor market legislation, tax legislation, a host of different factors. Informal structures as well, discrimination against women, traditional attitudes and religious beliefs, perceptions of entrepreneurship. There are lots of different reasons why female-owned firms, there are lots of different barriers that may actually exist that are non-financial, and that's the takeaway here. So we say, we think that the literature doesn't really pay close enough attention to these other factors, and that is really the main innovation in this paper. We assess whether and to what extent there is a gender gap, similar to previous studies, but the innovation here is that we pay close attention to the non-financial barriers to the business environment. This is important because, again, getting more women involved, entrepreneurship, ownership, important, as I mentioned, for all our development. But what this study does is, in focusing on different forms of barriers, it allows us, if barriers do exist, a more targeted policy approach in addressing those relevant barriers that may be affecting female-owned firms disproportionately versus male-owned firms. Let me jump to the methodology and estimation. So our main regression specification is going to be this one here, where we have y is equal to a function of female, a variable called female, some other factors, an error term. Y is the dependent variable of interest and takes a value of 1 if a firm faces a business environment barrier measured by, and this is measured at the level of the firm I and country C. Y consists, now we don't have one regression, we have several different regressions occurring here. We have Y representing 17 obstacles faced by firms in their current operations. These are the 17 non-financial barriers that I've been mentioning to you guys. So these range from telecommunications, electricity, you guys can probably read it off there. But yeah, again, what we're trying to do here is go after whether a gender gap exists beyond just those financial, access to finance. So there are 17 different types of regressions that we're running here, each one corresponding to a different barrier than a non-financial barrier. Or variable of interest, independent variable of interest is female, which represents, is a value that takes a value of 1. It's a variable that takes a value of 1 if the firm is female for firm I in country C, and 0 otherwise. So our interest is really on the coefficient of that variable called female. A significant and positive coefficient would suggest that that particular barrier that we're investigating disproportionately affects females versus their male counterparts. So what we're after is that coefficient on female. All these regressions, we do have a bunch of control variables in here as well that largely reflect the characteristics of the firm, and I'll mention to you why as I go through the results. All regressions include country and industry-specific mixed effects, and we estimate these using probate regressions. Okay, the data comes from a recent Protein survey that was completed by Compete Caribbean in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank. The survey, this was done in 2014, consists of 13 Caribbean small island developing states, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, a number of different countries within the region. So this study explicitly is on firms from a recent study in the region. And the survey comprises just shy of 2,000 firms across a wide cross-section, different sectors and industries, manufacturing and services sector. So I'm going to skip straight to results. I'm not going to present all the results. We've run 17 different types of regressions here. We run actually a lot more than that. Our initial investigation, which is in line with literature, is really an unconditional regression where we determine to what extent there may be the presence of a barrier. What the unconditional regression represents is the inclusion of the female variable. We don't have the control set in there as yet. And what we found, as I mentioned, we had 17 different barriers that we were investigating. These were the 4. that were found to be significant. So the others that were mentioned, those were not significant, meaning that they were no more of a barrier for women than for male firms. But what was significant in these unconditional regressions? Telecommunications, transportation, access to finance. We did access to finance so that we could compare our results to the previous literature. That's not really our focus, but that is in line with the previous literature. And then corruption. So we find potentially new additional barriers that have not been investigated, and particularly in the context of Caribbean countries. Now, these are the unconditional regressions. There's a possibility within here as well that while these suggest that these may be barriers, it's possible that it might actually be the firm characteristics that are really driving our results. It might be, for instance, that when we look at the data overall, we find that females tend to occupy smaller firms, for instance. And so to the extent that telecommunications or transportation is a barrier, it might not necessarily be one because it's a female-owned firm. It might just be a barrier because the firm itself is small, for instance. So we need to, this is where we run a second, we probe these results. This is our initial results. We probe these a bit deeper to determine, we include that full control set that corresponds to characteristics of the firm to ensure that our results are not driven by those firm characteristics. We can more reliably say then that the results that we have are in fact because of differences males versus female-owned firms and not factors that are unique to female firms versus male firms. When we do that, we reduce down, we find significance only in two barriers, telecommunications and transportation. We don't find significance when we have these additional controls in the case of finance. That is also consistent with the previous literature as well. So we feel that we're picking up the right things within our specifications here. Telecommunications and transportation, we find significant differences, which suggests then that these particular factors seem to be particularly acute to the development of female-owned firms. Our result is actually in the early stages. So we've identified, at this point, what we've identified are two barriers that have not, as far as we know, been identified in literature as potential barriers. What we plan to do from here is try to understand a bit more why these two particular factors are, they seem to be such humongous hurdles for female-owned firms in the Caribbean. We're not sure. And maybe you guys in your comments might be able to share with us some ideas about why telecommunications in particular and transportation might be such burdensome factors. But we have plans to administer perhaps some more focused studies to try to determine why these are in fact such humongous barriers to female-owned firms. Thank you.